Excellent, thank you so much. Hello everyone and welcome. This was right after lunch. You guys could have snuck off to your rooms and no one would have known, but instead, you're here with us and we really appreciate it. Like Raisha said, I'm Alla Valente. I'm a senior analyst at Forrester. I lead our research on enterprise and business risk, and I focus pretty heavily on third-party risk, contract lifecycle management because of its adjacency to third-party risk. And I get to dabble in things like cyber insurance from the risk transfer perspective.
And also senior analyst at Forrester. I cover all things cyber risk quantification. I wave that market. I also look at things like risk ratings and the role of that in the industry, and then with a heavy focus on GRC as well.
Excellent. So one thing I'd love for you guys to know is that at Forrester, every year we do a large survey of folks who are enterprise risk decision makers, and we ask them about many different risk domains, and third-party risk is one of them. Our most recent survey had something like 1,800 respondents who are all responsible for enterprise risk, either the budget, the strategy, or both. But for the purposes of our conversation, I focused my data on those who are at enterprise organizations that are probably most closely similar to you guys. And I know that third-party risk is often thought of as a technology market, but Cody and I speak to thousands of Forrester clients who are trying to build and maintain and expand and mature and all of the things around risk management, cybersecurity, and it's not about the technology or even the process as it is about the people, because when you're speaking to folks, it's really like this one-on-one, and you're trying to help them understand what's happening in this market or what they should be thinking about and doing next. And oddly enough, I find myself using a lot of idioms just to try to relate third-party risk to things that they're already familiar with. So that's kind of the theme of today's presentation. My goal is to tell you all about the state of third-party risk as it exists right now, and I'm going to try and do it in 4 idioms. How many folks think that I can get this done? All right, good. So first, why don't we define what an idiom is? The definition is that it's a phrase that, when taken as a whole, has meaning that you wouldn't be able to deduce from the meaning of the individual words. It's also a construction or expression whose total structure or meaning is not matched in the same way in a different language. So, with that said, we're going to talk about the first one. And we didn't move the slide. We're going to come back to this slide. Okay, so this is an idiom that you guys likely have heard before. And Cody, why don't you tell us, what does this actually mean? What is this referring to?
Engaging in trivial or irresponsible activities.
But that couldn't be the state of third-party risk management. I mean, who's engaging in trivial actions right now? There's so much going on. There are breaches everywhere. The state of third-party risk management is on fire. There's headlines. So why don't we see what this type of triviality actually looks like? Now, I mentioned earlier that we do an annual survey of enterprise risk decision makers, and we asked them, what is happening with enterprise risk at your organization? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it staying the same? 44% of them told us that enterprise risk still continues to increase. And then we asked those 44%, okay, well, why? And a quarter of them said, oh, well, it's because we have this increased reliance on third parties. That's interesting. So a quarter understand that more third parties means more risk to their organization. But we also asked them another question, which was, okay, here's a list of enterprise risks that your organization has to tackle. And considering the impact to your business, so very contextual, right? What are the enterprise risks that you're most concerned about? Now, let me preface this by saying this wasn't a pick 1, this wasn't a pick 3, this was you get to pick 5. Only 8% said that third-party risk was among the 5 risk areas that they were concerned about. I mean, that's pretty abysmal. But it's actually worse than you think, because last year's data, or last year's survey, 20% of them were concerned about third-party risk. So now somehow that's dropped off of a cliff. And you might ask, yes, Alla, but what were those other risk areas that they were actually concerned about? I gotcha. Data privacy, information security, financial risk, all important risk areas. But considering the impact of third parties on their business, considering the fact that they can't run their business without a third-party ecosystem, this doesn't seem to mirror or match business reality. I mean, come on, reputational risk is 15%, so double third-party risk. Half of these respondents, I'm willing to put money on it, don't even fully understand what reputational risk is. And colleagues of ours did a recent report, actually it's an annual report, where we look at the biggest breaches of the year prior, and we try and figure out what happened, what went wrong, and what we could do better. And so when looking at the top breaches of 2023, right, lots of lists of the top 100, we started to look at what were the causes or what attributed to those breaches. And among that top 100, we segment them into 7 industry categories. 4 out of 7 of those categories said that third parties were the top cause of breach at their companies. But what does that really mean, right? What does that mean in terms of level of concern? It means absolutely nothing. Because if you look at retail and wholesale, they were one of those industries that was significantly impacted by breaches last year. Their concern is actually half of the aggregate. You look at utilities and telecom and financial services that are kind of tied. Wonderful. Financial services has regulations, and they've been thinking about third-party risk for years now. It's great to see at least some of our critical infrastructure is getting there. And pleasantly surprised that public sector and healthcare actually have higher concern rates. But do you think that 14% concern for third-party risk as a critical element of your risk management strategy is enough? Because I don't. To me, this really is like focusing on the wrong things at your organization. So, the second idiom, burying your head in the sand. Cody, take it away.
To avoid confronting reality by pretending it doesn't exist.
We don't know any organizations that do that, because we're all really in touch with reality, maybe. So, same survey, we asked about the top challenges to managing third-party risk, because we want to understand what's keeping them from getting better, or what's keeping them from at least being good. Close to a quarter said that third-party risk is not a critical priority at their organization. It's sad, but it's accurate. 31% told us, well, this is all about competing priorities. We just have too much on our plate. We know what good third-party risk management looks like. We just can't do it because we have all this other stuff to do. And then 32% say, okay, look, it's important to us. It's important to our organization, but other risk areas are a higher priority. So let me put this into a little bit of context. Third-party risk is the long game. You're not going to make changes and have those changes change the trajectory of your third-party risk program overnight. Because they're focused on those risk areas, remember the data privacy and the information security, what they're focusing in on are the immediate needs of compliance. Because if I don't do this today, I will get fined tomorrow. They're managing to compliance, they're not managing to risk. Think of it this way. Compliance is your floor, it's not your ceiling. Compliance lets you know what the minimum standard or the minimum requirements are to function in that industry. But they're not going to help you avoid breaches, avoid disruption, avoid these negative consequences that impact your third-party ecosystem, because that actually requires you to take action above and beyond the mandates. And I know this is, right now it's considered that we're in a very regulatory triggered environment, right? But here's the reality. There are oh, wow, okay, well, this is getting romantic now. The reality is that there are very few regulations that actually call out requirements for third-party risk. I mean, yes, you have your OCCs, and you can say, well, there are pieces in healthcare, but quite honestly, they're only focused on the security as it relates to PHI and data privacy. We have a lot of frameworks, but they're not required, they're not mandated, and therefore, they're really not followed. If any of you follow my research or read my blogs, I had this very triggering moment about a year ago, waiting for the SEC to release its final rule on cybersecurity governance. I don't know if you guys read the proposed version, but it would have required transparency and reporting around areas that would have significantly improved third-party risk. By the time that final rule was released, all of that was gone. It was just stripped away. We do not have good requirements or universally applicable requirements for third-party risk. It's still very much piecemeal. So, it's also about the perception of risk management. Now, this is more about risk management as a whole than specific to third-party risk, but it's still really relevant. Because if 23% are going to tell us that risk management slows down business decisions, then 19 is going to say, yes, but it's also impeding our ability to innovate, and then adds a level of bureaucracy. Well, look, guys, isn't that the purpose of risk management, to say, we don't want you to move so fast that you break everything? It may have worked for Silicon Valley, but let's face it, it doesn't work for every organization. And now with generative AI, it adds this extra layer that we need to move quickly and decisively, but we can't do it recklessly. Which leads me to my third idiom. Rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Cody?
Or making trivial, we're going to look at this one, or ineffective adjustments in the face of impending disaster.
Now, look, it's not as if organizations aren't doing anything about third-party risk, right? I mean, we're receiving questionnaires, we're sending out questionnaires. There's stuff, right? There's stuff that's happening. But is it the right stuff? Is it the things that are really going to help you make any type of significant improvements? I don't know. Let's see. We do know that litigation is now this massive force. We like to call it, at Forrester, we call it this litigation juggernaut, because it used to be that if you got breached, you got fined by whoever the regulator was. And then, of course, there was the cost of fixing what you broke. And then, of course, you got to bring in the auditors and, all of that other stuff. But I'm going to tell you something bold. Regulatory fines are the least of your worries, because right now, you should be worried and keeping an eye on class action lawsuits. We know that class action lawsuits, especially around privacy and security, are escalating. And it's not just lawsuits coming from one direction. This is lawsuits from your customers and stakeholders and shareholders. They're all mounting class action lawsuits. It's class action lawsuits from employees if you haven't taken the proper duty of care or one of your third parties hasn't. But you don't actually need to be impacted directly by a third party to be sued, right? I mean, this is something that companies like Genworth and others found out last year when they got a class action lawsuit filed against them for MoveIt. They didn't even use MoveIt. But they're third parties, right? So down the chain. And now they're facing these types of class action lawsuits. When you think about the fines, the fixing, the assuring that the fixing's been fixed, and the class action lawsuits, that's a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of work that you could just be using to focus on the things that do really matter. And one of the biggest problems, or I would say challenges, of third-party risk is that most companies are only assessing a fraction of their third parties. Now, I want to preface this by saying two things. They're assessing a fraction of the third parties that they know about, right? Those are the folks that are in scope for their third-party risk programs. But that really depends on how you define the scope. Is this just classic software vendors, IT service providers, cloud? Are you expanding it out to non-IT third parties? Is this your supply chain or the suppliers in your supply chain? Is this your customers? Because I'm going to tell you that any entity that is not an employee of a company is a third party. And when we look at the largest sort of band that companies are assessing, the fact that it's only a quarter to about half, right? That's where they've settled on. This is frightening. It's great that those assessments are happening, but they're not happening on enough of the population. And then, if you want to add another layer onto it, you look at the folks who said, well, we're only assessing the relationships we're asked to, which means procurement got something in, and if they deem that it needs an assessment, then we get it, only then. Or only the relationships that we consider critical, or we don't actually track the evaluations of third parties. Not great. And there's another point I want to make about relationships that we consider critical. So most organizations, and this comes through their procurement teams most often, right? Criticality is determined by spend. I spend a lot, therefore they're important. But we know that that's not reality, right? Because how many times have we been breached, or partners have been breached, or we've read headlines of breaches that come from this really small, obscure third party? What I'm here to say is that if there's a third party that touches your data, financial data, employee data, intellectual property, has access into your networks, forget about how much you spend with them. They're a critical third party. And part of the problem is that we're using the wrong tools. Cody?
Yes, so let's talk about tools for a second. So I think it's about 56% of organizations globally use risk ratings as their primary tool for managing third-party risk. That's a little alarming because what that does is puts an outsized influence on the cyber consideration just for third parties, while often neglecting all the other domains of risk that are inherent in a third-party relationship. But that in and of itself is not the problem, right? This is a thing that the technologies have evolved to solve. But when we actually ask those people, the 56% globally, who who are using these tools, we ask them about the challenges that they have, even with just operationalizing their TPRM program and getting value out of that technology. You have some pretty alarming stats in my perspective. So immature internal processes. So that means the tech is not purpose fit for the actual problems they're trying to solve. Lack of integrations with internal security data tools. Most of those tools are not designed to really provide inside-out views of the organization, so quite a substantial limitation. And then another 30% say difficulty communicating and overseeing remediation action. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And maybe that's a fifth idiom we can put in. But in that situation, you can do as much. You can provide all of the information, all of the findings, but actually orchestrating the remediation side, that's a technical limitation in the tools that are being used for third-party risk management.
Yeah.
And then another one here. So kind of in keeping with the theme, what are we doing? Are we doing enough? Are these tools giving value? Are the programs we designed, are they effective? Well, we saw from Alla the alarming concern, or rather lack of concern, that organizations have when it comes to managing third-party risk. But what actually motivates them? What moves them forward? A breach. I mean, come on, is that really acceptable in this day and age for managing an effective program? Not really. But at least it is 17%, which is shockingly higher than the average level of concern.
He's optimistic, I'm not. He says at least it's 17%, and I want to know what happened to the rest, because this is not acceptable to me. Is this acceptable to you? That there's a problem and only, 17% are making any meaningful change afterwards? So, we know what's keeping third-party risk, what's holding it back. How do we move forward? How do we create strategies that are going to help us move the needle? Cody?
To make a noticeable positive change.
There we go. Here's what noticeable positive change looks like. The first is not ignoring non-traditional third parties. I mentioned it a couple of minutes ago, but this can't be, your program can't just focus on software vendors, service providers, cloud providers. There are so many broader relationships, and I'll give you one example. I know that the security tech stack is huge. It's vast, right? Every marketing email blast, unsolicited, that you get talks about the CISO dashboard. I'm here to tell you that the marketing dashboard puts the CISO dashboard to shame, because marketers are always focused on the new and the shiny. They're tech hopping like you wouldn't believe. In order to do their marketing attribution, their ROI for their programs, for their campaigns, they need data. That data is customer data. That data is financial data. That's data you don't want exposed. And yet, when you think about your third-party risk programs, how often do you include not just marketing technologies, but also all of the marketing consultants, all of the agencies, all of the PR, all of those non-traditional third parties? Because if you haven't considered it, you really should. Now, here's an example, obviously, of a very high-profile breach, right? Log4j, that revolved around open source. Open source is a third party, because if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, you don't have to have a financial commercial relationship with a third party for it to be a third party. Think of all of those freemium tools, right? You're still turning them on and turning them and connecting them into internal systems. If you're using parts of open source, you're not responsible for managing and updating it, and yet you're bringing it in. This is absolutely a third party that needs to be part of that, that inventory and focus for your program. The next is about TPRM maturity. Now, another preface here, right? The little asterisk at the bottom. So in our survey, we asked those same enterprise risk decision makers to tell us about their TPRM maturity. So this was self-reported. But here's what we found, because when we looked at the folks who said that they were at the higher levels of maturity, right, measured and optimized, versus those that are on the lower end of maturity, ad hoc and lower end, what we saw was that they had different perspectives on these common challenges. For example, there's a 14 percentage point difference between having a third-party risk program that's manual, right? Clearly, the high maturity organizations are less likely to have that manual program. The high maturity organizations are also less likely to say that they don't have a dedicated team that's responsible and accountable for third-party risk. They're also less likely to say that they're struggling with the volume of assessments and questionnaires and, this whole shuffling of budget and resources on that assessment piece versus other parts of their program. So when you think about improving your maturity of third-party risk, just know that it's not a futile exercise. It will actually help you move the needle in the right direction in terms of those challenges. And then there's attribution. So do you remember the very first slide that 25% said that their increase in enterprise risk was due to this over-reliance on third parties? Well, for those folks that know it's the third party, that understand that they have an issue and a problem with third-party risk, they were able to not only increase their budgets, but they actually got higher increases because they were able to do that type of attribution to say, it's not like we're going to stop working with third parties. We can't. That's part of our entire operating model. But we need more budget because we have more of them and they're getting more risky. And then finally, prepare for the non-cyber portion of third-party risks. Because I don't know of a control or a regulation that would have necessarily stopped the CrowdStrike outage. It's not just breach related. Anything that impacts a third party will impact you, whether they have some sort of interruption in their business. Maybe it has to do with something like an internal technology failure, or maybe even just a strike, depending on who that third party is. Maybe it's an issue with financial viability. Maybe it has to do with some sort of M&A that they were, product of an acquisition. When we think about third-party risk management, we can't hyper-focus on the cyber while ignoring the other factors, because those other factors are what's going to make the third party more vulnerable and also more susceptible to a breach. Here's an example. Did you notice that it was 2020 when all companies had to go virtual and work from home, that we started to see this tremendous escalation in cyber attacks against third parties? That's not a coincidence, but that was a systemic risk, right? Pandemic is on the list of one of our top systemic risks. So we have to think about third-party risk from the perspective of how mature are they and how able they are to manage their own cyber posture, and how they're impacted by external forces. Things like financial instability, geopolitical instability, physical events, hurricanes, a lot of disruption there. So look, here are the 4 strategies for how to move this needle. But before we go here, I'm going to go back to the slide that should have been moved and didn't get moved, because we have one more bonus. Thanks for bearing with me, guys. Appreciate that. Cody, why should we be more focused than ever on third-party risk management?
Well, to some extent, you've kind of already said it. It's the fact that it's proliferating, right? The issue is exacerbated by the emerging technologies that we're working with. We're trying to manage risk against every single day. But as your suppliers, as your third parties are also introducing these tools internally, that does raise the bar in terms of what is the governance needed, what is the level of control needed, what is the assurance overall that is needed. And this is a really good example, timely, because again, cannot be at a security conference and not talk about AI. But it's just a really good example of how this is changing the paradigm of what we think of when we actually say what a third party is. So I encourage you all to actually redefine third party in your organizations, to look at the Gen AI models of your suppliers as well, and making sure that you have sufficient assurance and controls in place.
Great. And we're almost there. But wait, if you purchase now, sorry, I couldn't help myself. We're going to talk about how to build that technology stack that's going to help you move the needle.
So it's really simple. What I want to say, what I'll preface this with is, when we should think about third-party risk and the way we manage it in terms of a tech stack, similar to the security tools we're already using. But the thing that a lot of folks get wrong in their TPRM program is that they're not actually focusing on all of the right data that would help them in delivering the right context that they need to understand the relative amount of risk associated with that. So when you think about your approach to managing risk, we're going to put 4 things on the screen. But you want to think about, from your technology perspective, do you have capability in these areas? Or is there an opportunity to supplement capability in these areas where you could use this to enhance the work you're doing? Ultimately, the goal here is to make the tech work for you. That doesn't mean there's one tool to solve it all. You're going to get a lot of information from a programmatic perspective to help you manage from a variety of sources. So a key part here is external intelligence. This can be risk ratings. It can be many other things. It can be financial data, M&A activity, sanctions, watch lists, whatever the case may be. But you need to have that. You need to have this incorporated, and you need to have a high degree of fidelity in that external intelligence that you're pulling in to make sure that it's operational. Because the other thing, you can easily go on the other end of the spectrum here, which is just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. If it's not actionable, it's not helpful. So the external intelligence component becomes critical for the tech stack.
The next is assessment questionnaires. Now look, I get it. I hate them as much as you do, right? Nobody likes a questionnaire, but they are critical because they provide that contextual inside out and not just relying on the ratings that are outside in. There we go. Here's an example. If you go to the bank because you want a mortgage to buy your house, it's one thing that they look at, let's say, your salary and how much money is in your bank account, and will say, well, we're either going to approve you or not. Because you also, right, if you're a loan officer, you also need additional information. You need things like, well, what are the expenses and what are, like, is there any type of recurring revenue? You need to understand how long, that person's been in their job and, like, what the confidence level is that they'll be able to maintain that particular, like, salary to be able to pay off the mortgage. You can't look at just the external, only cyber-focused data. You need to understand, how does this match up with the third party or the vendors? How does this match up with their controls, with their maturity, with their investments? Are they doing things like tabletop exercises? Do they have a plan for resilience? What happens in the event of some sort of disruption? Do they have the right team and sufficient resources? Those things are important, and that's context you're not going to get from a rating or that outside-in approach, no matter how far those AI crawlers crawl.
And from the technology side, you also want to think about here, not just doing the assessment for the sake of the assessment, but how are the tools and tech and the vendors that you work with to deliver the questionnaires, how are they improving the actual questionnaire process? You shouldn't just accept that you can take a tool just because it offers a questionnaire. There should be other factors in that platform, in the technology, that's helping with doing a lot of the automation, validation of responses that are in place, and leveraging AI, of all things, to really accelerate how you transform the information that you collect so that you're actually collecting the right things, as Alla was saying. Want to lead us on enterprise apps?
Yeah, enterprise applications. There is so much data that exists inside of your organization that could help you manage third-party risk. The problem is you don't know about it, you don't know it exists, and you can't link to it because of the different silos that are likely created, federated programs and such. And here's why. Third-party risk is a shared responsibility. And we know that shared responsibility models are really difficult because the folks that are responsible for third-party risk are very different than the folks that are responsible for the relationship with the third party. Still different than being responsible for the consequences or the legal implications if something goes wrong. Until you start to link up your third-party risk technology with other tools like the contracts, right? Like the service level agreements, to understand what exactly have we specified as necessary for this third party? What are those contractual terms? Can we actually terminate in the event of something unforeseen and unplanned? You need that type of information, and that should be used to help you decide and interpret the actual risk level, the contextual risk level of that third party.
So if you make it this far with your tech and you're evaluating all of the data sources, you're improving the questionnaire, you're integrating with other tools internally to inform that context, this already moves the needle quite a bit just in terms of your relative maturity. But this is still not enough to actually manage risk effectively. You need the last part, the whole reason why we're here, FairCon. You need the quantification layer. And what we mean by this, again, is not a risk score. What we mean is the actual material impact on the bottom line to the business of all of that context. So you've brought in the data to inform how well that vendor operates. You have the questionnaire to collect more data and to validate and use that as an actioning tool. You've got the enterprise apps to inform the overall business context of that relationship. And the quantification layer is where you bring in the financial impact for the top risk scenarios relative to those third parties and the suppliers that you're maintaining. So all of this has to come together, but this is a glaring gap today in how people design the tech stack for their risk management programs, specifically for third party. And we know it's not enough because of all of the data points that Alla showed us at the beginning, and we know that it's gonna take a while to still get there, but bringing these together, this is how you truly move the needle.
Thank you. And any questions? Oh, technology. See, I figured you guys would be an interactive bunch. Someone stands up, raises their hand. No? Wrong audience?
Sorry, it's loading. Okay, question for you, Alla. Do third parties themselves realize they pose a risk as a third party to their clients or users?
Of course they do. They have. Let me change that. Most do, because they are a third party to someone, but they have their own third parties, right? They have to understand the cycle. The problem is they also struggle with those same challenges, that they can't do better to provide that type of assurance to their customers because third-party risk is not a priority, or they have other priorities that are more important. The problem that we're trying to solve for is once you understand the criticality of third-party risk in that enterprise risk stack, once you understand that significance, then you can start to take steps to help improve. It's not going to be overnight. This is a long game, not a short fix, right? And you can start to put some technologies, some processes, and other types of improvements to help the maturity of the program and hopefully the maturity of the ecosystem overall.
And one last question that I'll pose to you as well. So thinking about running a large-scale TPRM program, a global company, team of 2, over 5,000 vendors, how do you possibly begin to prioritize your third parties?
Before we even prioritize third parties, I think global team, see, he sneezed on the truth. Global team with 2 resources, I'm sorry, like that's crazy, right? I mean, that's what's going on. No,
Yeah.
I understand it's difficult. So look, if we're going to start to prioritize what those third parties need to look like, the first thing we need to do is understand and possibly change the scope of who is in scope for third party risk, right? If the business expects that you're trying to assess third-party risk of all of these various relationships, but your bandwidth is only to do a fraction of it, they need to understand that. Similarly, I think starting to use things like a pattern detection to understand from a prioritization perspective the concentration risk. So for example, we have this one third party, but they're responsible for whether it's a service or a technology that supports multiple areas of our business or multiple business processes. The higher the dependency, the higher the criticality. I think that's what we're going to have to do, but still try for more.
I will say this is where, especially because to your point, I mean, that is the lived reality, right? Most governance and risk and compliance teams are so small for organizations, but that's why you need to focus on the things you can actually control. So looking within your organization to focus, point at that screen, the external intelligence, the quality of the questionnaire itself that you're using, the enterprise data sources. If you step back and actually look at it from a programmatic perspective and look at these things, your goal then becomes to optimize the resources you do have and put that better context. So if your focus is on the cybersecurity piece, what is the data you collect? How are you validating it? But also, don't make your team of 2 people run and sprint to try and manage 5,000 assessments for those 5,000 suppliers. Focus on the questions that matter and understanding the business relationship itself, the impact that that supplier has from that risk scenario context.
Yeah, I'll add one thing, because here's what's really interesting about that question. Large global organization, team of 2. So what in my experience I've seen from large global organizations is they have this very federated approach to third-party risk. Now, this team of 2 could be this dedicated third-party risk program, but more oftentimes than not, you're going to start to see risk and security resources in other areas, or maybe it's by like different geographies or different departments, depending on how they've federated it. I think you also need to, try to figure out where those other risk management resources are within that global organization, and at the very least, enlist them in your effort, create that common taxonomy of what is a risk and what is a third party, and start to build that prioritization collectively.
That's it. Thank you.
We have time for one short question, if people have. Yes?
So measuring third-party risk is fine, but I think the end of that is you want to then treat the things that you found.
Yes.
Right? And so the historic way that we've been doing that is contract. Right? And so if we take, for example, CrowdStrike, if they did customize their contracts for every customer, what are the chances that they're actually going to deliver on every one of those customized contracts in a unique way that they sign that contract with each customer? And if they're not going to, which of course they're not, what was the point of doing all this in the first place?
Yeah. Ooh, that's a really good one. So 2 things here. One is using the contract to help you enforce, I think is really important, because the only time you have any leverage over a third party is before that contract is signed. Here's what I'm going to recommend. Whoever is responsible for third-party risk at your organization, I think you need to start to collaborate a bit more with the contracting teams. Take a look at what those standard agreements look like, especially third-party paper, because if you're buying, chances are that contract is on their paper. I think really the first step is saying that if this is third-party paper, here are the terms that we find acceptable, and here are the terms that we don't find acceptable. You're going to need to revisit what those standard agreements and templates and clauses look like, and also, to the extent possible, try to conduct the risk assessment. Now, I know CrowdStrike, really large organization, you could say, well, their risk score is, really good, but if they are this large organization and you're relying on them for something critical, then, at the very least, there need to be clauses built in requiring them to take certain actions in the event of a disruption. And that disruption needs to be clearly defined, whether it's just in the event of a breach or other type of disruption, because that's where a lot of folks got hung up on what happened with CrowdStrike. It wasn't a result of a breach. It was, operations. So one of the first things I think you need, I guess maybe everyone needs to do, is take a look at what that contract looks like, and start making some updates that help protect you in the event of a cyber event, as well as events from the third party that are not cyber driven.